Welcome to This Week in Christian History, a podcast from the Center for Christian History at Mississippi Christian University. The Center for Christian History is dedicated to expanding knowledge and understanding of Christian history. Our mission is to provide a scholarly, unbiased look at the events, figures, and movements that have shaped Christianity over the centuries. You can visit centerforchristianhistory.com for daily historical highlights, and each week on this podcast, we'll do a deep dive into key moments with Christian history's leading authorities. Our first historical highlight for the week is Lottie Moon. On July 7, 1873, the Southern Baptist Foreign Mission Board appointed Moon to missions work in China, where she would spend the next 39 years ministering to the Chinese people. Moon understood that meaningful ministry began with genuine relationships. Before trying to evangelize, she invested time in the lives of the people around her, especially children. She welcomed them with homemade tea cakes, thereby earning the affectionate nickname the Cookie Lady. Additionally, Moon strongly advocated for expanding Protestant missions. Through her letters home, she urged Southern Baptists to send more missionaries and provide greater financial support for the work. Her appeals inspired the first Christmas offering for foreign missions in 1888, a tradition that eventually became the annual Lottie Moon Christmas offering. Today, that offering has funded generations of missionaries around the world and remains one of the defining missions efforts of the Southern Baptist Convention. Our next historical highlight and the subject of our deep dive is Rhode Island's Royal Charter. In the 17th century, most English colonies expected religious conformity, and those who challenged the established order often faced banishment, fines, or imprisonment. Roger Williams, a committed Christian, believed that civil government should not control matters of conscience, and his vision received official recognition when the colony of Rhode Island was granted a royal charter on July 8, 1663. To the colony's inhabitants, the charter guaranteed, quote, the free exercise and enjoyment of all their civil and religious rights, end quote, making Rhode Island one of the most religiously tolerant places in the English-speaking world. Our final historical highlight for the week is the Golden Bull of Eger. As King Frederick II of Germany and Sicily sought to be elected Holy Roman Emperor, he faced a significant obstacle, winning the support of the powerful German bishops and clergy. On July 12, 1213 AD, he addressed that challenge by issuing the Golden Bull of Eger, a charter that formally renounced many royal claims over the German Church and granted sweeping privileges to the clergy. The agreement confirmed that bishops and abbots would be freely elected according to canon law, with only limited royal involvement, and it recognized the Church's authority over many of its own lands and legal matters, reducing the ability of secular rulers to interfere in ecclesiastical affairs. In return, Frederick secured the political backing of influential church leaders for his imperial ambitions. Ironically, Frederick would later become one of the papacy's fiercest opponents. His reign would be marked by repeated conflicts with Popes Gregory IX and Innocent IV, who would excommunicate him multiple times. Today in our deep dive, Nick Walters, founder and director of the Center for Christian History, talks with John Barry about Rhode Island's Royal Charter.
Hello and welcome again to yet another episode of This Week in Christian History. And we are focused this week on an event that happened on July 8th, 1663 is when Rhode Island got its official charter. And we are using that event to talk not only about Rhode Island, but more specifically about Roger Williams. And as one of the true founders of America, and his impact, and particularly how that relates to the idea of the hedge and the separation of church and state. And we are glad to have John Barry with us, who is a great historian and author, and has written a book, or wrote a book, I should say, on Roger Williams. So, John, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Fantastic. Well, tell me a little, how did you get interested in Williams in the first place? Of all the founders and all the people that you could have picked, how did he make the cut?
I'm actually from Providence.
Ah, no,
Um,
okay.
and people assume that's how I was interested, but it wasn't. That's a coincidence. Um, and it's kind of an odd story. I wanted to write a book about the home front in World War One.
Mhm.
You know, there's a chapter in my book, Rising Tide, about the 27 flood. Chapter 10 talks about everything that was going on during the war, which led to all sorts of things in the 1920s. And I had scoped that out. I knew exactly how I wanted to proceed on that book. And I had identified several figures I was going to follow. One of them was Billy Sunday, who
Huh.
was the
Okay.
first evangelist who really got involved in politics.
Hmm.
And just doing my due diligence, looking at the history of, you know, a religion and politics in the United States, I went back to Roger Williams and John Winthrop. Uh, and that relationship and that story seemed so good, I abandoned the idea of writing about the home front in World War One. Went back several hundred years to the early 1600s.
Wow.
Winthrop, was the one who gave the sermon on the way to America, called by the New York Times the greatest sermon in 1,000 years, in which he first used the phrase, we are to be a city on a hill.
Hmm.
Reagan, of course, changed that to we are shining city on a hill, which is actually not Winthrop's words. And Winthrop and Williams were actually, Williams almost saw Winthrop as a father figure.
Wow.
But theologically, there was no distance between them. Williams was a Puritan, and there was a great deal of discrimination, actually persecution of
Hmm.
Puritans by the king, uh, and which ultimately led to a civil war and the beheading of the king and the beheading of an archbishop. So the Puritans had fled England, not for religious freedom, but for the freedom to practice their religion as they wanted. Nobody else was going to get any freedom. And as I say, Williams and Winthrop, no distance between them theologically. But Williams arrived in Boston, was offered uh, pastorship of the church in Boston, which was the premier post of its kind at the time, and he declined it because they weren't pure enough for him.
Hmm.
He ended up going to Salem. The real difference between, uh, well, let me back up a second. One of the interesting things about, Williams is very well known as the author of the phrase, the wall of separation between
Hmm.
church and state. And the whole concept of separation of church and state. What people don't recognize is that he was mentored by Sir Edward Coke, who's probably the greatest judge in English history. He was Chief Justice of England. Unless you're a lawyer, you never heard of Edward Coke, but every American over the age of 5 probably knows his most famous ruling from the bench, that the house of everyone is as his castle. So obviously today we know that is every man's home is his castle.
Hmm.
And the idea was that you were free to do what you wanted in your own home. And Cook also defied the king. The king threw him in the Tower of London. Cook's response is, if the king desires my head, he knows where he may find it. So Williams had this
Hmm.
sense of individual freedom that was part of his whole sense of being. Uh, he also thought there was a possibility of being wrong. Uh, there were, he was a scholar. He read the Bible in several languages. There were discrepancies in translations. discrepancies in interpretation. Some of them were pretty significant. They couldn't all be right. So there was always the possibility of error. Also, in the context, you've got to remember, as I said earlier, the Church of England was moving closer and closer to Catholicism under the king. They were persecuting Puritans. On the continent of Europe, Christians were murdering Christians because of the way they followed Christ. So he understood that when you mix religion and politics, you get politics. That the church was going to be corrupted by any contact with the state. It wasn't in his idea of freedom of church and state or separation was not because he was an atheist. It was far from it. It was the reverse. It was because he was so devout. He did not believe, he thought any contact between the state and the church would corrupt the church. So, there were a lot of other things about him that were unusual. For example, he thought that Native Americans had every right to their lands, and that the English couldn't simply take land. They had to buy it from Native Americans. This created quite a bit of conflict for him in the Massachusetts colony. So he was, somewhat disruptive in Massachusetts. They banished him. They were going to return him to England in the middle of as soon as spring came. And had that happened, he would have been imprisoned. If not, he probably would have died in prison, as a matter of fact. So he fled and ended up founding Rhode Island on the basis of total separation of church and state. In fact, and this is really extraordinary, the founding document for Providence, which actually preceded the charter you were talking about by several decades, he drafted the founding document, and in one of the drafts, he asked for God's blessing on the effort. But in the final compact, which everybody signed, he eliminated that. He did not ask for God's blessing. And the reason was, again, he considered any connection between the civil government and the church would corrupt the church. And, frankly, if you look at religion and politics today, I think he had something going for him there.
All right, well, let's back up to be able to tell us more about him personally, about his life, and kind of how did he, where did he grow up? What was his background?
Well,
How was his...
he grew up in London.
Okay.
We think he was born in 1603. We're not certain of that. When he was about 13, he became an amanuensis to Cook, whom I mentioned. The only thing he ever said about his father was that he was persecuted in and out of his father's house these many years. He obviously didn't get along with his father, whether that was a personality clash or whether that had to do with his developing ideas about the churches. It's unclear. He actually referred to Cook as, at some point he said, how many thousand times have I thought of the example of Cook's courage, I cited earlier, and he really saw Cook somewhat as a father figure. He learned Algonquin, the Native American language, was certainly one of, and arguably the most fluent Englishman in New England in Native American language. He traded with them. He got the land for Rhode Island from members of the chief of the Narragansett tribe. On several occasions, when Massachusetts threatened Rhode Island, with Massachusetts obviously much more developed, much bigger and so forth, he went back to England to get protection. And one of those, he was a friend of Oliver Cromwell.
Right.
He taught John Milton Dutch. He had written a dictionary of translating English into Algonquin, which actually made him a bit of a, and it's a very interesting document, even reading it today, because it's more of a sociological description of Native Americans. And that actually, he got that published in England on his first trip back, and that made him a bit of a celebrity in England. And give you a sense of his idea of, he certainly tried to convert Indians to Christianity, but he said, forced worship stinks in God's nostrils. He felt it had to be voluntary. When Massachusetts was trying to pressure Native Americans to convert, they actually got in touch with Williams in England. Williams went to Cromwell, and Cromwell ordered Massachusetts to stop. Cromwell was probably the only person in the world the Puritans in Massachusetts were afraid of, and they did stop. So again, that sense of it has to be God has to be in your heart. No hypocrisy. One of the other interesting things about Williams is even his most bitter enemies, who opposed everything that he stood for, liked him. He was just, apparently a really nice guy. And back to religious freedom, Massachusetts was whipping Quakers,
right,
and actually hanging Quakers. They banished them. If they returned after you were banished, you could be executed. And Massachusetts did execute several Quakers. Williams theologically agreed with Massachusetts. He thought Quakers were an abomination, but he's in his late 70s, and instead of trying to use the state power of Rhode Island against the Quakers, he actually takes a canoe and canoes to Newport and debates Quakers who were 30 or 40 years younger than he over a period of a couple of days. So again, it's the voluntarism, the refusal to use the power of the state against how you're thinking. All that is not only essential to what Williams thought, but I think that's at the basis of the United States. I think it's, whether how do I say this better? There's a difference between being a Christian nation and a Christian government. And Williams would be all for being a Christian nation. But again, the idea of a Christian government, he considered totally wrong and dangerous to the purity of the church.
You can watch the rest of Nick's interview with John Barry by clicking the View Full Interviews button on the podcast page of centerforchristianhistory.com. This Week in Christian History is produced for the Center for Christian History by Blue and Gold Media at Mississippi Christian University in cooperation with the MC Department of Communication. For episode transcripts and more information, visit centerforchristianhistory.com. Be sure to subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, and follow the Center for Christian History on Facebook and Instagram. Our next podcast episode is coming next week. Thank you for listening.